My name is Lars Dahle. I'm the Lausanne Catalyst for Media Engagement and also in the steering committee of European Leadership Forum. And right now I'm privileged to be joined by Olof Edsinger. And Olof is a General Secretary of the Swedish Evangelical Alliance, is an accomplished author and also a family man. And what is there more to tell about your life?
Well, I write a lot, but I've also worked a lot with youth and young people during the years.
You were the founding General Secretary of a youth organization in Sweden, weren't you?
Yeah, that's correct. I worked for 9 years building it up and also trying to lead it.
And the organization has a name that is close to a Bible verse, I think?
Yeah, we called ourselves SALT from the Sermon on the Mount, being the salt of the earth.
And right now we are going to focus on the whole area about queer theory and the whole area about sexuality. Could you describe generally what queer theory is?
Well, one interesting thing is that this is really a hot topic right now in the West, and not least in Sweden, where I live. But just 10 years ago, almost nobody knew about it. So that's one part of the story. But queer, well, basically it means to be odd. In the beginning, that was the word. It was those who were sort of on the fringe, really, when it comes to sexuality and identity. Today, I would say that queer would mean sexuality outside of the categories. Sexuality as something fluid. There is no fixed sexuality and no fixed gender. No fixed identity, really, because the queer ideology opposes what they would term binary opposites, either or, male or female, normal or abnormal. They rather see these things as fluid and oppose those opposites.
Sometimes queer theory appears in an acronym with a number of letters.
Yes.
Could you explain what are we talking about?
Well, I suppose you refer to the LGBTQ, yes. And you could actually add some more letters, yes, on that one.
So let's clarify, what are those letters? What do they stand for?
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer. And then you also have intersex and some other. And the fact that queer is quite late on that scale also tells us something, that the first sort of big issues or battles were fought concerning gay, lesbian issues. But in a way you could say that as those issues have been dealt with or those battles won, they have moved forward into the trans and queer issues.
And when you're saying they're being won, you mean that the lobby movements that have been working, yeah, toward change in society, yeah, have actually managed to achieve change. Is that right?
Yeah, precisely. The LGBTQ movement is a strong lobby organization. It is many things, but among those, that is one aspect. Also political power, and that is very clearly seen in Sweden and also in many other countries.
So you're saying queer is in a way a more extreme point of view, a more towards the, yeah, margins point of view at the outset?
Yeah, you could read the issue in many dimensions. One is what I just said, that if you have a big group affected and then you have smaller groups. So you would say that the lesbian gay movement, that is quite a large group comparatively. The trans community is a smaller group. The traditional queer community is really an even smaller group. But what has happened is another thing, and that is that the queer ideology has become a very strong movement, much bigger than those who would traditionally be calling themselves queer.
Would you say that queer has become part of mainstream culture now?
In Sweden it has. In most countries it has not yet. But there was kind of a fight within the LGBTQ movement about a decade ago. In some countries, including the Nordic countries, where the traditional gay movement was actually in a discussion with the queer ideologists. And the queer ideologists would say to the gay movement that, hey, you wanted to be able to marry, you wanted to get the right to adopt children, but through that you have actually expressed some kind of liking for the heteronorm, the privilege that the heterosexuals have. Since you want the same privileges that those people have. We want to sort of erase all those boundaries.
So you say that the queer community, or on the basis of queer ideology, it was an accusation almost against the gay, lesbian communities of being almost
too traditional.
Yeah, and heteronormative.
Yes. Yeah. And most people may not realize that the LGBTQ movement, although they would do some actions together, it is many different ideologies within that.
So what would you say is any unifying elements within the whole, all those different lobbying groups?
Well, one big unifying thing is the identity of being a minority. And also, of course, creating your own identity from your sexuality. Mm.
But you're saying actually that they are a minority in terms of numbers as groups, but at the same time the ideologies have, as it were, entered into mainstream culture.
Yes.
As you said, at least in Sweden. Why in Sweden? What are any of the changes? What may be some of the changes that happened in Sweden that resulted in that?
I think one major reason is that the LGBTQ issues have been advancing very much in Sweden and becoming very mainstream. And when, as I said, when the battle is sort of won in one area, then you move on to the next. So I think that Sweden has been sort of prepared for another level of this kind of struggle and ideological war.
So how widespread would you see queer ideology is at the moment in Sweden?
Well, we see it in different shapes. One shape would be the actual LGBTQ movement or the Pride festivals or such.
And the Pride festivals happen usually once a year, do they? Or?
Well, we have the biggest one in our capital, Stockholm, but they also have similar festivals in many cities in Sweden. And this coming summer, when we speak now, will be the big Euro Pride in both Stockholm and Gothenburg. Interestingly enough, they will have trans as the theme for the whole festival, which also illustrate that the minorities are brought into the forefront.
Again, illustrating that, yeah. Yes. Yeah. So you said, are there any other reasons regarding the Swedish situation, you would say, historically or in the contemporary society that has contributed to this growth of this ideology and this becoming part of the mainstream culture?
Well, I would say that one very central aspect of the queer and also trans ideology is the self-identification. That I myself identify who I am, what my sexuality is. When you choose your identity on Facebook in Sweden, you can choose between 70 different gender categories. So there's a whole range of different specific categories, and that speaks to the individualistic ideology that I can define myself. And then we also have a specific reason looking at legislation. We have an anti-discrimination law mentioning 7 different categories for what could be discrimination.
Like discriminatory behavior or even attitudes maybe?
Yeah, that could differ. But your sex, of course, but also your sexual orientation is one of those grounds. And that has created kind of a market for these things, because that means that everywhere you need to work with the law, obviously. So in school, in preschool, everywhere, you need to bring these issues up and work with them, even among the smaller children. And what has happened is that the anti-discrimination work, or the strategy rather for anti-discrimination in Sweden, has become very much influenced by queer theory, because queer theory has a way of viewing differences that differ from how we used to work with these issues before. If you take a word like tolerance, which has been a very important word in a postmodern setting, it's good to tolerate one another. For queer theorists, that is a bad word, because to tolerate someone still implies that you may be in some kind of majority position, but you want to tolerate the minority. Since queer ideology is founded on the idea that there are no majorities, there is nothing such as a normal state or whatever, so they try to avoid tolerance and instead have the strategy of viewing all similarities as equal, and there is no difference in how you value them.
So, if we go thinking about the concept of tolerance, if we go back historically, there was a basic understanding that tolerance was that first of all one disagrees and then one respects one another, yes, despite disagreeing. Yes. Then you have the postmodern concept of agreeing and then tolerating. But you're saying actually queer theory moves a further step, saying that tolerance as such is not to be tolerated, as it were.
You need to accept the idea of everything being fluent, and that is a huge step, actually.
So everything being fluid.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not just sexual identity being fluid; it's actually a much wider concept.
Yes, this is applied on many different areas, the only people that cause problem, obviously, are those who stick to the older categories. Those who still view, for instance, heterosexuality as more normal or natural than other kinds of sexuality. They are the problem, and they should be marginalized.
We have spent quite a lot of time now talking about how we should understand, how to analyze the situation. And we are going to move soon into how to assess it, how to evaluate from a Christian point of view. But is there anything more you would like to add in terms of the actual analysis of the situation?
Well, there are many things to say, of course, but I would especially point at this radical individualism, the self-identification, that goes hand in hand with it, and the fact that this used to be controversial also within the LGBTQ movement, but has become mainstream.
When then moving from the analysis to the assessment, what personally worries you about the normalization of queer theory in our culture?
Many things. One other way of just putting this sort of new paradigm would be to say that if you look at like the women's rights movement or for like 100 years ago, they would say that men and women are different, but they are equal. Therefore, we should all have the same rights. For instance, women should have the right to vote in public elections. And many Christians were a strong part of that movement. Then you had the second wave of feminism coming in the 60s, late 60s and 70s. They would talk about gender or social roles as something created, not given. Queer theory is...
Something constructed?
Yeah, constructed, yeah. Yes. Social roles as constructed. Yeah. Whereas your biological sex obviously was still something that was given. Therefore, you had feminism, because feminism is built on the fact that there are women, females.
And that's a clear category then,
yes,
within that stream or that movement.
Yeah, but both the queer movement and the trans movement question that view, saying that gender is something that is really in your mind, including your biological sex. So your body, your functions, your hormones, your chromosomes, none of that matters. It's just what you personally feel to be. And that also illustrates this journey ideologically, but also what causes the problems that I will soon mention.
You mentioned the trans movement. Just before moving on further into assessing this, could you explain briefly what is the difference between queer and trans?
Yeah, well, trans would be more identifying yourself with the other sex that is not your biological sex. For different reasons. It may be something that you probably are even born with, but it has also developed into an ideology where you can choose, basically, who to identify with. Whereas queer has this idea of sexuality being fluid. So there are different concepts, and sometimes they are working well together, and sometimes they actually oppose one another.
It would seem to someone observing that the trans movement is actually accepting the differences between the genders at some point, saying, I'm not the right gender, I want to change to another gender. Whereas queer is then actually saying there is no fundamental difference here. Would that be a right assessment?
Yeah, that's correct. And that is one of many contradictions within this movement.
But obviously, as you are a cultural critic, you contribute to Swedish debate on this public debate. I know you have written a number of articles, and then you are raising critical issues. Yes. And what are those critical issues?
As I mentioned in the beginning, I have been working a lot with the young generation, and not least in the Nordic countries, and not least in Sweden, we have a very high degree of psychological, people not feeling well psychologically. And I think that these trends have quite a great role to play in that development. For instance, if your biological sex does not say anything about who you are, because that's what queer theory says, your biological sex has nothing to do with who you actually are. You define that yourself. That may seem like a liberating message to someone who actually doesn't fit into his or her own body, but the vast majority does. And what you're saying in that sentence to that group is that you cannot trust your instinct. You cannot trust that what you see in the mirror is who you actually are. So you put some kind of anxiety or insecurity on the majority that used to be applicable only to a small minority.
So it's actually taking what is an identity issue for a small minority.
Yes.
And transferring that to a majority identity problem. Is that right?
Yeah, and I mean, all people basically struggle in some way with their identity, for instance, during their teens. And since this ideology is very much marketed in the young generation, it sort of enlarges that uncertainty. And I think it will create a lot of frustration, a lot of insecurity, experimentation. I mean, when you have had 5 girlfriends and 5 boyfriends, that also creates some kind of baggage to handle in life. And we can already see that. And in Sweden, it is also quite popular among young people to, for instance, not linking sex to love. You can have sex with a friend, and if you take love out of the equation and you also take gender out of the equation, then basically everyone who is available is a potential sex partner. You don't need to be in love, and it doesn't need to be your opposite sex. I mean, of course, that creates a lot of confusion and really hurt people.
Yeah, and I would presume it also creates a lot of pressures. I mean, if this is becoming increasingly a role model, I mean, a model way of acting, something that most people do it, therefore I have to do it, that kind of situation.
Yeah, and once again, there are many aspects. One is the aspect of basically promiscuity, but also almost like a fashion with the transgender, for instance, that some very famous artists and media figures have come out as trans, and that also sets a standard. And I heard of one class in school in Sweden where they had to fill in forms about, I don't know what the issue was, it didn't really matter, but in the beginning of the form you sign if you are a girl or a boy or other. And 1/3 of the pupils ticked other. And that to me illustrates, obviously, not all of them, probably none of them would biologically or psychologically be termed trans, for instance. But they had gotten this perception that you shouldn't really be too sure about that. So that sort of gives me an idea of what's going to happen in the future.
So it's beginning to generate a cultural confusion.
Yes.
In relationship to personal identity.
And this radical individualism that everyone defines him or herself.
If we then move from these general assessments about culture to a biblical perspective, what are the most important elements or principles of a biblical perspective on identity, sexuality, and gender that are applicable into this situation?
Well, to start on a positive note, I would say that queer theory does underline that there is something broken in creation. And I think we should give them that as a correct concept, that yes, it's not so cut and clean with our sexuality or our identity or anything really. We are all affected by sin.
This reminds me of a quote from the famous Christian author and thinker Francis Schaeffer, talking about that we are glorious ruins.
Yeah.
And you're saying this is actually reminding us of that.
It is, and I think that also myself, being a heterosexual male, will still identify with this brokenness. I'm not the sort of ideal for everyone to look at. We are all broken. But in the midst of that brokenness, God still holds up heterosexuality and the marriage, specifically between man and woman, as the ideal that he still wants us to look at and express.
So when I know you are doing a lot of teaching, especially for youth leaders, youth ministry leaders, and for youth pastors and for young people. What do you emphasize then in the biblical teaching when addressing their ministry or their lives in a context like the one we have described here?
Well, I would emphasize one thing that is really important here is that to have a stable identity is something good. And for a Christian, we actually have the Trinity as the perfect model of identity. 3 persons in one being, distinct but yet together.
So God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and being such even before the creation of the world.
Yeah, and then being together but still in distinct categories. That is a model for us to see that I might be together with others and be influenced by others, and I actually in some way become in relationship to others. But I am in myself a distinct identity. And that is very much in conflict with the Eastern way of thinking, where identity is something more fluid. And I would see strong links between Eastern philosophy and religion and the queer theory, actually.
Do you think that's a parallel phenomenon, the Eastern thinking and the queer, or are there actually links historically?
I would say they are probably linked spiritually. I would see the same spiritual roots.
Because this is also a spiritual matter?
Yes. I mean, the devil, Diabolos, he's the one who breaks things, pulling them in different directions. And this is really what queer theory is about. It breaks identity and pulls stable things from each other. And when I look at the creation narrative, telling us how God created the heavens and the earth, in Genesis 1, yes, the sort of pattern that goes on and on is that God is separating into two. He separates heaven and earth and land and water and creates the different species. And he later also separates man from woman. They become two distinct persons. So this binary or binary opposites is a very strong concept in the Bible. And it's nothing to try to avoid, but rather something to embrace.
This emphasis on either or.
Yes. Then, of course, sometimes the church has been too eager to make very sort of strong statements about what is male and what is female, and sometimes we have pushed that too far.
Could that have to do, could that primarily be related to gender roles, maybe?
Yeah, mostly, I would say. And I would call for humility when it comes to gender roles. I do think that there will develop some gender roles in every culture, but we shouldn't be too firm on exactly what they should look like.
So there is an openness in the biblical perspective for creating something culturally contextually appropriate.
I think so.
At the same time, the Bible gives us some guidelines as well.
Yeah, because we have our biology, we have our hormones, and all that. That will create different roles by necessity. But we shouldn't be too firm about that, maybe.
What do you think Christians can do to prevent the further spread of this ideology? What can we do to counter it? What would be the appropriate strategies that we should engage in?
One bit of it would be the same as when we talk about the LGB issues, that your sexuality is not your primary identity. Of course, your sexuality is part of your identity, but there are other things that are stronger markers for that. And for me as a Christian, it's the bottom line of it would be that my identity should be in Christ, what He has done for me, not what I can do for Him or anyone else.
Do you think that's an area where we need to strengthen the preaching and teaching in our churches?
I think that there is maybe no other area that is of such crucial importance than identity to preach on in these days, yes.
And if you had 1 minute to present what is the absolutely key biblical teaching on identity, what would you say?
Well, that is a hard question, but I would say that to view your biological sex as your friend and not as your enemy would be one way to put it. And even if you struggle with your identity, to realize that there are many things together that make up your identity, that your sexuality is not really worthy of being the primary identity marker. And that there is healing also in not letting it be that, because you somehow put your trust in a too small category.
So what I'm hearing is actually a liberating message from the biblical perspective.
Oh yeah, I view this whole issue from my perspective, and the way that I talk about this is a big part of the diaconia of the church. We have a hurt and wounded generation out there, and we would totally fail our mandate if we just sort of played along with that trend.
So there is both a liberating perspective within the Christian worldview and the Christian and the gospel as such about identity in Christ and forgiveness. And you touched on the healing and dimension. Could you expand on that? What kind of healing is implicit in the biblical message of grace in Christ?
Well, it works on many levels, and the most foundational to me, of course, is that when I become in relationship with my Creator, that when I find my own destiny, and sort of the pieces fall into place when that happens. So that's the foundational healing. But also in the whole ideology of both trans and queer, I see what the church fathers would be also struggling with as Gnosticism. where you
When you
are-
say Gnosticism, what is that?
Yeah, well, it's first of all, it's an heretical teaching in the church, but its basic assumption is that the creation is inferior to the spiritual world, and as to be sort of complete as a human, I should leave the created matter, and
Which
become-
applies to our bodies then?
yeah, and become more of a spirit and sort of express myself spiritually. And that also causes a great skepticism towards God as creator. So the traditional agnostics would not emphasize that. And when I see people denying their own body, their biological sex, for instance, as something irrelevant or even a problem to overcome, well, that is what we traditionally would call Gnosticism. So to find your rest, so to say, in your body, in your biology, that is actually also a way of healing in this confusion.
Are you being filled with compassion when you see young people today struggling with all these kind of pressures?
Oh yes, it must be a really tough world to be brought up in. And also this illusion of preaching freedom through radical individualism and in opposition to the creation, that is, it's an obvious dead end, but that is the vision that they have bought into. And
We have addressed a number of issues about how to relate to people on a personal level, how to relate in a church context, and also how to relate in teaching and in preaching. But there is also one additional dimension to this, and that's the public arena, the marketplace. And speaking out of your own experience, what is your advice to Christians who would like to make a difference in the public arena, who would like to be salt and light, as the wonderful name of the youth organization, being salt?
Yeah.
And you know, the call from the Bible, from Jesus, is so clear, it seems, that we have a prophetic responsibility to speak out. But how can we do that winsomely with such a contested area as this?
Well, to be honest, I don't think we can do it and expect everyone to be friendly about it. These are very heated topics, and also there is a spiritual battle going on behind this. I'm very sure of that. I would say generally when I talk about LGBTQ issues is that we need to distinguish between the person and the phenomenon. That it needs to be visible for everyone that although I oppose some ideologies and also some lifestyles, I do not oppose the person. That is easier to say than to practice, but it must be our goal at all times. And to be generally kind to the person while we try to sort of still prove that some ideologies don't really stand.
So when you are speaking into a context, I'm sure there are, in a public context, the marketplace, I'm sure there are situations where you speak in more general terms, and there are situations when you speak more explicitly from a Christian perspective, and sometimes maybe generally, and then implying some biblical material. So how do you distinguish how to relate in the public arena in those different ways?
Yeah. Well, generally, when I speak in a public arena, I never even mention the Bible. If someone asks me, I would, of course. But that's, I mean, and here's the strength of being having a belief in God as creator, because this is really concerning the creation. And what I do is that I always point to statistic, to the views of medical experts, research, because interestingly, those figures almost always support a Christian view on these issues. Because you can't separate scientific truth from theological truth in this area. They go hand in hand.
As it is said, all truth is God's truth.
Yes,
And that's also very much true in this area.
Yes, and I also see that the queer ideologists and many from gender ideology as a sort of bigger group are not that interested in natural sciences, to be honest. It's a very postmodern approach to life, that your views and your feelings are more important than...
And that sort of overrules everything else.
Yes. So generally they would not even ask for what science says or something like that. But still, at least in Sweden, science has a high sort of a good reputation. So if I can actually point to statistics, this is what happens at the surgical clinics, this is the outcome. For instance, if you take the trans issues with also sex surgery, well, we can show some quite troubling statistics about that, and I didn't make them up. I took them from the authorities, so then I could use them also in a public debate, of course.
Do you think well, none of us would be a prophet in terms of the future, but when you're looking towards, what's happening now and trying to imagine what's happening towards the future, since queer theory is becoming part of the mainstream culture, can you imagine a situation where also people working in the science areas are being influenced by queer theory so that they won't be able to produce the kind of statistics and results and findings that you're pointing towards?
I don't think the whole sort of scientific community would be affected by that. Although I shouldn't prophesy here, I do think that there will be a backlash because these ideologies are so extreme. But what is actually troubling me more is when you look at psychologists. In Sweden, when you go to university to become a psychologist, then you read a lot of queer theory and norm-critical pedagogy and stuff. That is influencing the young generation of psychologists. So we will live with this for a long time, but there will also be backlashes. And as you said, the truth is on our side in this matter. And I want to be on the side of the truth. And I mean, we need to be humble and realize that maybe sometimes we have been a bit too fixed in our categories. I don't mind saying that, but this is taking it far too far.
So what I'm hearing you saying, there is a place for both confidence in the truth of the scriptures, and all truth is God's truth, at the same time a place for humility. And because we haven't always understood and applied that in a way that is factually correct or even compassionate enough.
Yeah. And I mean, just looking at statistics, although they differ, but say 1 person in 5,000 in Sweden is transgender by birth, that is having the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, or being able to get that diagnosis rather. We cannot take that lightly. We need to meet those people. What I have a problem with is when their diagnosis is made into an ideology that is supposed to be applicable to everyone. That is the big problem. The problem is not the small minority who have gender dysphoria. I feel very sorry for them, and they should get all the support that we can give them. In some cases that may implicate some treatment. Although we know that many who have, for instance, undergone sexual surgery after that are not very happy either. So it doesn't always solve their problems, and we should also be very clear on that point. But we should keep our humility in these issues. But the ideology that tries to force this way of thinking on a whole generation, that is vicious. I wouldn't mind saying that. And we have an obligation to react to that.
Finally, there might be Christian young people watching this. Should they be confident in what the Bible says about sexuality and about identity?
Oh yeah, well, that's a leading question. Well, many would still ask, what does then the Bible say about that?
Well, presupposing a classical understanding of the Bible, you know, about the heterosexual marriage between man and woman as the appropriate framework for the sexual intimacy.
Yes, I'm very confident when it comes to that. And once again, we could also show both statistics and many different scientific evidence on that kind of family structure being the best for all involved. I firmly believe the biblical foundational view of gender and also of marriage and sexuality. So none of this is really about questioning that. It's rather to also meet people where they are and try to help them see the strength of that vision and also help people to be a part of that vision.
Olof, it has been a pleasure to have this conversation with you, and thank you for taking the time and effort to really to delve into these questions, which are so important in our culture today. And I wish you God's blessing on your ministry, and thank you for sharing with us today.